Welcome to Wonderland, a place to deconstruct ideas, to understand your body through nutrition, hormones, and psychology. And in doing so, to inhabit your body with dignity, respect, and pride. Hello, my name is Fran, coach with Team ProPhysique, professional bodybuilder, psychologist, nutrition consultant, wife, and mom. So grab your favorite drink, take a deep breath, because I promise you information that can transform how you listen to your body, support what your body truly needs, and help you fall in love with yourself all over again.
Hello, girlfriends. Today we are going to talk about how perimenopause and menopause is affecting our brain. Have you noticed changes in your memory, on your focus, on your mental clarity, and wonder if you are just stressed out? But at the same time, you also wonder, could this be something else? Many women do not realize that perimenopause is actually a neurological transition, and this transition needs to be supported because the brain is adapting to a new hormonal environment. So in this video, I am going to cover 4 points. What is actually happening in your brain during perimenopause, also why your memory, mood, focus shift during this phase. Also, why this transition is more sensitive than we think. But most importantly, what can we do right now to protect our brain so it can stay sharp long term? Today, we are going to talk about how perimenopause and menopause is affecting our brain. And this is a very special topic for me because when I started experiencing those symptoms, I didn't even know that's what it was. Something felt very different in my body. And honestly, it scared me because the only thing that I had knew about perimenopause was the hot flashes, which I was not experiencing those. I didn't understand what my body was going through, and I didn't even have a reference point. And that confusion, that uncertainty creates unnecessary stress and unnecessary fear. And that is exactly why I'm here. Because if I can help at least one woman to understand what her body is going through and what to expect and how to support that transition, and if I can take some of that fear and some of that confusion away, then this conversation is worth it. I'm doing this for my friends, for my sisters-in-law, for my clients, for all the women that I know and that I love. And also, I wish I knew this a lot sooner so I can support my mom when now looking back, I knew that she was going through this, but I just didn't know. I find very interesting that for decades, science have told us that menopause is only an ovarian event. Doctors have been saying how estrogen drops and so the ovaries stop working. But neuroscience is showing something a lot more interesting that makes actually a lot of sense on the symptoms that we experience. Neuroscience is saying that menopause is also a brain transition. The brain is actually a very sensitive organ to the estrogen, and several brain regions actually rely on estrogen to regulate metabolism, temperature, sleep, and mood. And the brain is actually a very sensitive organ to the estrogen. Actually, we have regions in our brain that actually rely on estrogen to function properly. And those regions regulate the metabolism, the sleep, the temperature in our body, the cognition, the mood. And one of the most important regions is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is actually the one that connects or communicates with our endocrine system, the one that regulates our hormones. And the hypothalamus communicates with the pituitary gland and the ovaries through a system that is called the HPG axis, or the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis. I know, another mouthful. So when the estrogen starts to fluctuate, the hypothalamus becomes dysregulated, and that dysregulation contributes to many of the symptoms that we experience. Hot flashes, for example, they are not generated in the ovaries. They originate in the hypothalamus, which becomes highly sensitive to any temperature changes. But temperature regulation is only one piece of the puzzle because estrogen is deeply involved in the brain energy metabolism. And even though the brain is very small, it uses actually the 20% of our body's total energy. And to sustain this high demand, the neurons rely heavily on glucose metabolism. And actually, estrogen is the one that helps the neurons to convert glucose into ATP. And ATP is the energy available that the neurons can use. Think of it as the fuel for the neurons. So when estrogen declines, the neurons are going to become less efficient at that conversion. Therefore, they're going to have less energy to function. But the good thing is that research have found that during perimenopause, there is often a temporary brain energy deficient. In fact, some scientists describe it as only a neurological bioenergetic transition, meaning it is a transition. The brain will adapt eventually. And this process is not necessarily pathological. As we mentioned, it's a neuroendocrine transition. And like many many other biological transitions, the brain always finds a way to adapt. Because one of the most encouraging discoveries during this transition is that the brain is not passive during this phase. It is actually always trying to adapt to this new environment. Because when glucose metabolism becomes less efficient, the brain begins to look for other energy sources. One of those sources is ketones, and ketones are found in fatty acids. And that is why metabolic health becomes extremely important in midlife. Because when the brain is adapting, it's essentially always looking for that energy supply. And that ability to adapt will depend on several factors. Things like mitochondrial health, insulin sensitivity, inflammation levels, sleep quality, and nutrient availability. In other words, the brain's resiliency to adapt in menopause will be directly affected by lifestyle and your metabolic health, which is why this transition can be experienced by two different women in a completely different way. Because for some women, this transition is relatively smooth, while for others can be overwhelming. And understanding what's happening inside the brain, it is actually the brain's step to support it. And another major process in the brain during menopause is the neurological inflammation or neuroinflammation. Again, estrogen is not only a reproductive hormone, it is also a very powerful anti-inflammatory regulator in the brain. It actually helps to control the immunity activity in your nervous system. So when the estrogen declines or fluctuates, it loses part of this protective anti-inflammatory signaling. And that can activate the microglia, which is basically the brain's immune cells. They are the ones in charge of cleaning the damaged cells and keeping the nervous system functioning efficiently. But the problem is when they become chronically activated, they can promote inflammatory signaling in the brain. Another reason why some women experience mental fatigue, low mood, irritability, sleep disturbances, and increased sensitivity to stress. But this inflammation can also interfere with the neurotransmitter balance, including the serotonin and dopamine pathways, which can directly affect the emotional state of the woman. Those emotional changes are not only in our head, they're in our brain. They are linked to these neurological changes happening during this phase. One of the reasons why scientists started to study menopause was because they noticed that 2/3 of the people with Alzheimer's were women. For many years, this was very poorly understood, but researchers now are discovering that menopause can be a critical neurological transition period because estrogen plays an important role in protecting neurons from oxidative stress, mitochondrial damage, and metabolic decline. But here's the important part. Estrogen also helps to regulate the amyloid beta in your brain, which is important because the accumulation of amyloid in your brain, it is actually one of the biological markers for Alzheimer's disease. So obviously, when estrogen declines, some of those protective mechanisms becomes less efficient. But no, this does not mean that menopause causes Alzheimer's disease. It just means that menopause represents a very vulnerable window where the brain health becomes extremely important. And that is why researchers are now focusing on this transition because they understand that this is a critical period for a preventive brain health. And the good news is that many of those factors that cause brain aging are completely modifiable. Okay, so if menopause is partly a brain transition, one of the most important strategies is protecting the brain metabolism. Remember, the neurons rely heavily on the mitochondria to produce ATP, energy. And estrogen helps the mitochondria to produce that energy. So when estrogen declines, the brain becomes temporarily less efficient at using glucose as fuel. But we already learned that the brain can also use ketones as another source of energy. So the goal is to support that metabolic flexibility. And that flexibility means that the brain can be efficient at using glucose or ketones. Now, this does not mean that you need a ketogenic diet, but it does mean maintaining unstable blood glucose. Maintaining also our insulin sensitivity because mitochondrial health becomes extremely important in this midlife. So how does that look like? Well, prioritizing an adequate protein intake, consuming high quality fats, maintaining good muscle mass, and avoiding chronic metabolic stress from constant dieting. Hopefully you know by now that muscle tissue helps regulate your blood sugar and your metabolic stability, which indirectly can support the energy supply for the brain. One of the most powerful tools to protect the brain during menopause is actually the exercise, but also directly influences the brain. Resistance training and aerobic exercise both stimulate the production of BDNF, and that is called sometimes a fertilizer for the brain. It supports neuroplasticity, neural survival, and the formation of new neural connections. Exercise also improves insulin sensitivity, increases the mitochondrial density, and even increases the blood flow in the brain. And that means that oxygen and nutrients can be delivered to the neurons. And there's actually evidence that physical activity can help regulate estrogen receptor signals in the brain, meaning that the brain can become more responsive to the estrogen that is still present, even if it's less. In simple terms, movement tells the brain to stay resilient. And as we know, brain's resiliency becomes especially important during these hormonal transitions. Another key factor for brain health during menopause is the dietary fat quality. And why? Well, simply because the brain is 60% fat in its total weight, and neurons rely heavily on fatty acids to maintain flexibility and also to communicate with other cells. And one group of fats that has received especially attention by neuroscientists is the omega-3 fatty acids, especially DHA. And researchers associate the intake of omega-3 with the cognitive protection and also reduce neuroinflammation. So yes, fat quality truly matters. Sources like olive oil, seeds, nuts, avocado, egg yolks, and fatty fish. The goal is to improve that quality fat intake. Another overlooked factor in the brain health is the sleep, because during deep sleep, the brain activates something called glymphatic system. And this is essentially the system that the brain uses to clean itself or to detoxify itself. It helps remove metabolic byproducts, and it actually helps remove the amyloid beta that we talked about that is associated with Alzheimer's disease. So poor sleep disrupts that process. And unfortunately, on perimenopause and menopause, sleep is disrupted. That is why it's particularly important to support the sleep during this transition, because the sleep is not just rest. Instead, it is active neurological maintenance. So yeah, menopause is often referred as a decline, but biologically, it is actually more accurate to say that it's a neuroendocrine transition, because the brain is only adapting to this new hormonal environment. And like many other biological transitions, this one can also be supported.
Because when we understand what is happening inside the brain, we move away from fear and we start approaching it with knowledge, understanding, and with a strategy. By supporting that metabolic health, maintaining movement, prioritizing the sleep, and nourishing the brain with the right nutrients that can help the brain to stay resilient. So again, the brain is not failing during menopause. It's just adapting. And adaptation is something that biology is very good at. We just need to support it a little bit more. I know that this phase is very nuanced and it's not that straightforward, especially because we're all different. All those shifts on estrogen and how they affect our brain can look very different from person to person. And how our nervous system perceives all those changes can really be affected on how we experience this phase. And the combination of everything can make fat loss a little bit trickier and slower, because the brain interprets all of this as stress. And if the body is stressed, we'll always prioritize survival over fat loss or aesthetics. I find many women at this age pushing really hard for that fat loss, because what used to work in the past is not working now. But I always tell them, your physiology has changed. Therefore, the approach that you use also needs to change. It needs to match your physiology. That's why I created a coaching specifically for women in this phase. I am also going through perimenopause. I understand that this transition is not only physical, it's neurological, it's hormonal, and deeply personal. And my goal is to guide you in a way that keeps your body responsive and your results sustainable. So if you are going through this phase and you feel like your body is not responding the way you used to, you don't have to figure it out alone. In the description below, you will find a link that will ask you a few questions. Name, email, stuff like that. Very simple. And I will get in contact with you so we can figure out the best approach specifically for you. And if you think that this information is useful, send it to a friend that is going through the same thing.